Welcome. My name is Kosch from the Department of German Studies at the University of Vienna, and I'm a research associate of the project Listening to Literature, Experiencing Literary Audiobooks, which started earlier this year and will run for 3 more years. Under the title The Auditory Reception of Literature, Experiences and Practices with Audiobooks, I will now give an insight into audiobook research and present the results of our first study. I will start with a short outline and perspectives on listening to literature. Auditory reception has always been an important way of consuming literature. Listening to narratives and poetry is at the beginning of literary history, from the ancient bards via the semi-oral culture of the Middle Ages to the reading aloud of printed books that played an important role in European reading culture until the end of the 18th century. Furthermore, the first encounter with literature in a person's life takes place in childhood when listening to stories and rhymes in storytelling and situations of reading aloud. Research on the influence of reading aloud and reading socialization and the widespread practice of reading aloud in primary schools show time and again that auditory reception is the beginning of engagement with literature and literary texts. In the 21st century, listening to literature has again become a substantial and vivid practice in the contemporary literary scene, either in terms of author readings and poetry slams or as podcasts and especially audiobooks. From a media history perspective, it was the invention of the phonograph by Edison in 1877 that made it possible for the first time to record and reproduce sound and thus to hear spoken words independently of a present person. From the term talking book emerging in the 1930s to the term audiobook in the 1970s with the use of audio cassettes as an alternative to records, the usage of audiobooks has changed due to technological developments, as the example of Rubery shows. While the audiobook was for a long time a byproduct of the printed book that was published later and as a service for readers with disability or dyslexia, this has changed greatly with digital media. Audiobooks are now often published at the same time as the printed book and allow a choice of medium for particularly literary text. New portable delivery technologies like the smartphone has also expanded the places and situations in which audiobooks are received. It is therefore not surprising that the digitization of audiobooks in particular has led to an increase in listening to literature and that its status must be questioned anew. Recent numbers provide a good reason for focusing on the reception of literary audiobooks. The Pew Research Center reported a rapid rise in digital audiobook consumption among adults in 2019. While print and ebook readers remain similar to a 2016 survey, the percentage of Americans who say they listened to at least one audiobook in the past year increased from 14% to 20%. In short, with more and more people consuming literature via audiobooks, it appears highly relevant to understand better how such a change in the mediality of literature consumption might affect a reader's or listener's literary experience. Since the beginning of audiobooks, the question has always been whether listening to books counts as reading. Because of concern that listening to books might lead to a poorer reception of literature than reading a book, audiobook listening is often considered a shallow alternative, or as Sven Burkhardt asked, is listening to books an extension of reading, or is it a simplification, yet another ingenious way of turning everything into entertainment? On the other hand, advocates of audiobooks often present audiobooks as fully equivalent to printed books, offering the same experience, the same text, just delivered to the ears rather than the eyes. In addition, it is argued that audiobooks offer something that printed books don't. They restore the human voice to literature, adding a dimension of intimacy that is missing on the page. In this way, the producers claim that talking books are both exactly the same as printed books and sometimes significantly better. In principle, our project seeks to further systematic understanding and empirical investigation of the consequences for individuals' literary experiences when the reception shifts from reading to listening to narrative fiction. Therefore, the following research questions are central to this study. What are the consequences for individuals' reading experiences when literary experience shifts from reading to listening to narrative fiction? Are there any differences between listening to and reading literary texts, and what dimensions of the literary experience are affected? How do practices, situations, and contexts differ in dealing with literature when texts are heard rather than read? To answer these questions, we conducted a focus group study, which will be followed by experiments and further studies. Focus group interviews are a productive approach to reveal unconscious and incorporated patterns in media practices. The goal of focus group interviews is not, as in quantitative research, to isolate causes and effects, to operationalize theoretical relationships, and to quantify phenomena, but they instead aim to discover new aspects and to develop empirically founded theories. Consequently, our data is delivered by the self-descriptions and collective discussion of the listening practices of persons who are familiar with using audiobooks to guarantee that there is no bias in the results due to the fact that people could be surveyed who are not used to deal with digital audiobooks. We recruited the participants via flyers in audiobook stores, bookstores, and via social media. We conducted 7 focus group interviews with 4 to 6 participants, which were accompanied by a short online questionnaire. In total, our sample consisted of 34 participants, and the participants were 18 to 57 years old. The analysis of the transcripts came down to collecting various experiences, identifying common patterns, and classifying opinions on our focus topics. Therefore, we worked with the data analysis software MaxQDA, and 2 of the authors executed both the construction and refinement of the coding scheme. For coding, we followed a framework that we developed for describing the auditory reception of literature. The framework builds on the fundamental assumption that listening to literature occurs in a complex interplay among the text, the medium, the listener, the situation and practices, and associated effects. Thus, 1,237 text passages were coded and structured on the basis of the 5 main categories and a wide variety of subcategories, and then subjected to analysis. Before we'll go into detailed analysis regarding pace and voice, I would like to note a few general findings from now. Audiobooks are clearly separated from other auditory formats such as podcasts, radio plays, or radio formats, and serve a unique function. Listening to audiobooks takes place within alternative situations and contexts enabled exclusively by this medium, thereby predominantly involving different genres than reading. Audiobook engagement often enhances routine activities such as commuting and various tasks, thereby giving special importance to the context of reception. The narrator's voice is considered to be of great importance in both the selection of an audiobook and the literary experience itself. It is quite noticeable that when it comes to every aspect or dimension of the literary listening experience, that there are various and often conflicting perceptions. For instance, the immersion and emotional impact of narrative texts as audiobooks are evaluated differently, both positively and negatively, as exemplified by the following 2 extended quotes. So, I see at least a higher emotionality in the audiobook compared to the book, and the content also seems more vivid to me. So, when a narrator assigns different roles, different characters of a book with different voice colors, speaks higher, lower, slower, faster, whatever, then I also have a completely different panorama in front of my mind's eye than I could now read or experience myself. On the other hand, better imagination, immersion and emotional involvement when reading books are also frequently mentioned. But I can actually immerse myself much more deeply when reading a printed book. And I think that's because when I'm reading, I'm using the whole mass of my imagination, my own. And with an audiobook, some of the imagination is taken away from me by the narrator. So, a crucial distinction between reading print and listening to an audiobook lies in the cognitive processes involved in pausing, reflecting or revisiting previously encountered content. Furthermore, the pace of consumption is a crucial factor in the reception of literature. Typically, one reads at their own pace, whereas in listening, pace is determined by their recalling. Conversely, when reading printed books, readers can adjust their reading speed to suit their preferences, following or allowing for greater flexibility and control. This distinction is a vital consideration in the scientific investigation of the auditory reception of literature. It is also interesting here that the predetermined speed is preserved differently in the audiobook. A few examples. And what's a significant difference for me is that with audiobooks I sometimes grasp more because I tend to read in a very scattered manner. It's self-evident that this isn't the case with audiobooks, as I can't skip ahead in the content without actually hearing it. Same. But when I'm listening to an audiobook, I don't skip those parts, so I end up having a better overall understanding. On the other hand, reading books is attributed an advantage in terms of the pace of engagement. That is exemplified, for instance, by the two quotes provided on the right side. And what I miss a bit with audiobooks is the pausing. Because when I'm reading, I pause more often, I've noticed. With audiobooks, you'd have to hit stop, and I don't really feel like interrupting the flow. A similar example. When I'm listening an audiobook, I notice I drift off. I drift into my own thoughts, but the audiobook keeps playing in the background, and that usually annoys me briefly. And I never experienced this while reading, because with a book, when you have a thought, you don't continue reading. And that's different, you know. So, in the following, I would like to discuss one aspect that most clearly distinguishes the audiobook from the printed book: the voice of the narrator. When a text is transformed into an auditory experience through the medium of a narrator's voice, several parameters, including pitch, volume or tempo, are introduced. Thus, a narrating voice must make a selection from the various possibilities of vocal performance and choose an interpretation that will be predetermined for the listeners. Therefore, the voice cannot be reduced to the function as an information carrier, because many aspects are conveyed through the voice, for example gender, age, origin, states of tension or excitement. The audiobook narrator's voice might also compete with the listener's inner voice, as a concrete audiobook voice with recognizable attributes may well come into conflict with one's own voicing while reading. Nevertheless, the voice seems to be able to give a distinctive profile to the characters, places and story worlds of a plot, which probably also leads, among other things, to stimulating the user's imagination in a special way. As one participant pointed out, you see, you have your own voice in your head, and when you listen to someone else through an audiobook, you just enter a different world, a different level. This is expressed very impressively in the following quote. And the second major difference for me between books and audiobooks is that through the narrators, nationalities and language peculiarities like dialects become much more pronounced. Initially, when I'm reading a book, I do notice the character is speaking with an accent, like Poirot with his Belgian accent, for example. But as I continue reading, I forget that, and hear, as I mentioned earlier, my own voice, which of course speaks without an accent. Finally, I would like to summarize a few general aspects of the listening experience with audiobooks. Audiobook listening differs from the reading of books as it entails distinct expectations, objectives, occurs within varied situations, and involves different textual content. The act of consuming literature through auditory means is not clearly perceived as inferior or superior compared to the act of reading. Instead, a variety of distinct perceptual perspectives prevail. Variations in text navigation, like pace, etc., are perceived with varying degrees of positivity. And above all, listening to audiobooks is seen as enriching everyday activities, bringing the consumption of literature into novel situations and routines. This focus group study is only the beginning of our project, and we've just started the evaluation and analysis. This means that further results will follow, and we will add experimental studies to it. Researching the listening experience with audiobooks is still a desideratum in literary studies, and we will be dealing with it in detail in the next few years. I thank you for listening and hope that we will be able to talk in person on site. See you soon.